I'm Evelyn Carter, 31 years old, the daughter they never wanted to claim. In this family, Claire shines, father rules, mother smooths over the cracks, and I am the silence they pretend doesn't exist. I used to think being ignored was safer than being mocked. Until the day Richard Carter never dad, only Richard looked me in the eye and erased me from his will, calling me a waste. That wound never healed. It only hardened. Ever been told you were nothing in your own family? Hit like if you've carried that weight, and comment if silence ever cut you deeper than words. For me, it begins tonight with his birthday dinner. The night they expect me to fold, and the night I finally prove them wrong. The words slipped through my lips like a mantra I had repeated too many times, though this morning they carried a sharper edge. The sunlight spilled across the minimalist penthouse I called home, clean lines, muted tones, and the faint hum of the city below. It wasn't grand, not like the Carter estate, but every inch of it was mine. Mine because I had earned it with sleepless nights, corporate battles, and choices no one in my family ever thought I had the strength to make. The silence was almost comforting, until my phone shattered it with its shrill ring. I already knew who it was before I even looked at the screen. Richard Carter. Not father, not dad, just Richard Carter, the man who made sure I understood that I was nothing more than an inconvenient afterthought in his legacy. I hesitated for a moment, then swiped to answer. Evelyn. His voice came through, clipped and firm, the same tone he had used at the boardroom table, the same tone that had once crushed me. You will be at my birthday dinner tonight. There was no greeting, no softening, just a command, as if I were still the child he could order into silence. For a second, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear and let the weight of his demand settle. My mind flicked back years ago, the sterile lawyer's office, the heavy smell of leather and old books. I had stood there clutching acceptance papers, my heart racing with the fragile hope that my father would be proud I had been admitted to an MBA program. Instead, his eyes had cut into me like blades. You want me to pay for this nonsense? Richard had barked, his lips curling with disdain. An MBA? It's a waste of money. You don't have the head for this, Evelyn. Stick to something simple, something within your reach. You'll only embarrass yourself and this family if you keep chasing illusions. That memory never softened. It was etched into me, fueling every late-night study session, every professional gamble, every risk that had forged the woman I had become. Back in the present, I let silence hang on the line. Richard disliked silence. It forced him to repeat himself, and repetition annoyed him. Do not embarrass us tonight, he said finally. Each word weighted like a verdict. The chill in his voice slid down my spine, cold and familiar. The call ended without a goodbye. I let the phone drop onto the couch, my pulse steady, my breath measured. In the background, faint laughter carried through my memory, Claire's laugh, syrupy and cruel. She had been there that day too, smirking as though watching me fall was her favorite pastime. I imagined her now, probably already dressed for tonight's spectacle, waiting for me to stumble in like a lamb into the slaughter. But I wasn't the same girl they had rejected. I walked to the mirror that spanned the wall of my living room. My reflection stared back, sharper cheekbones, steady eyes, a woman who had built her own world outside the shadow of the Carter Empire. The bitterness simmered beneath the surface, restrained but alive, as if my veins pulsed with it. Tonight, they expected humiliation. Tonight, they wanted me to fold into the role of the forgotten daughter, the disgrace. I placed my hand against the glass, holding my own gaze as if swearing an oath. The air in the room felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the city itself was listening. Let's see who embarrasses whom. Nice dress, sis. Did you borrow it from a thrift store? The text blinked on my phone screen, Claire's venom dressed in sarcasm. I didn't need to hear her voice to feel the sneer curling her lips. Some people chose weapons. My sister had chosen words sharpened over years of cruelty. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of my apartment, painting streaks of gold across the hardwood floor. I sat at the edge of my bed, the phone heavy in my palm. My thumb hovered, but I didn't respond. Instead, another image clawed up from memory. Claire, leaning against the glass wall of a recruiter's office years ago, her smile syrupy as she announced she had spoken to a friend and secured the position I had been chasing for months. I remembered the hollow ache in my chest, the way my carefully prepared portfolio had felt useless in my hands. She had walked away that day triumphant, turning my ambition into her trophy. A second message arrived. A photo. Claire in an emerald silk gown, the designer logo tagged below as if she wanted strangers to know just how much money hung from her shoulders. I traced the outline of her smirk with my eyes before tossing the phone aside. Some things never changed. I rose and crossed to my closet. It wasn't lined with gowns in every shade, nor guarded by a team of stylists. Instead, it held only what I had chosen for myself, pieces bought with deliberate care, each one a silent rebellion against the family who believed my worth could be measured in brand names. My hand found the hanger I had set apart days ago, a simple black dress, nothing ostentatious. To the Carters, it would look plain, but the seams told another story. The fabric had been tailored to my frame with precision, the fit exact, the details subtle. Understated power whispered through its simplicity, a quiet defiance wrapped in elegance. The phone rang again, this time with the name Margaret Carter flashing across the screen. My mother. I hesitated, then answered. Evelyn? Her voice came softly, though not warmly. There was always distance, a kind of rehearsed gentleness that seemed more obligation than affection. Your father's birthday dinner means a great deal. I need you to behave tonight. For appearances. For appearances. Always appearances. I could picture her in the Carter dining room, pearls at her throat, rehearsing her smiles for the guests. She had lived her life smoothing the rough edges Richard created, justifying his harshness, excusing his cruelty. I understand, I said evenly. I let no bitterness seep through, though it simmered in my chest. What I wanted to tell her was that appearances were the least of my concerns. After the call, the silence of my apartment returned, heavier now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the Carter disdain. I slipped into the black dress, its weight surprisingly comforting against my skin. My fingers lingered on the zipper, tugging it up with deliberate slowness. Each motion felt like armoring myself. On the dresser sat a small velvet box. I reached for it, the soft texture brushing against my fingertips. I opened it briefly. Inside lay the item I had prepared, the piece of leverage carefully guarded, the symbol of what they had never believed I could possess. The sight steadied me. With care, I placed the box into my purse and closed it gently, as if locking away a secret the world wasn't ready to see. The phone buzzed again, another message from Claire. Tonight, everyone will see who the real Carter daughter is. The arrogance radiated from every word, so familiar, so tired, and yet still capable of stoking the embers within me. I walked toward the mirror, letting my reflection fill my vision. The dress clung in all the right places, silent sophistication against the noise of my sister's jewels. My lips curved upward, a smile not of amusement but of certainty. I leaned closer, whispering into the glass, each word carrying the weight of the years they had tried to erase me. They will, Claire. They will. Le Magnifique glows with chandeliers, a stage for the Carter family's performance. The Manhattan restaurant shimmered like a palace, golden light spilling from crystal fixtures onto marble floors, polished so smooth they mirrored every step. The scent of truffle oil and aged wine hung in the air, blending with the low hum of elite chatter. This wasn't just dinner, it was theater. For the Carters, it was their stage. I lingered just inside the entrance, letting my gaze sweep over the scene. A memory pressed against me years ago. I had walked these same halls not as a guest, but as a server. My hands had carried silver trays heavy with champagne flutes, my ears tuned to the careless laughter of the wealthy who never once saw me. I remembered the ache in my feet, the weight in my chest, and the vow I had whispered in the kitchen then. One day, I would not be invisible here. Richard entered first, shoulders squared, every inch the titan of industry. His suit looked as though it had been sculpted to his frame, each step announcing his dominance. Margaret followed, her pearls catching the light, a smile poised like a mask across her face. Then Claire, wrapped in emerald silk, her gown shimmering with the arrogance stitched into every seam. They walked as if gravity itself bowed to their wealth. I followed behind. My dress was plain by comparison, black and understated, yet perfectly fitted. To the untrained eye, it whispered modesty. To those who looked closer, it murmured precision. I knew the whispers would begin before we even reached the table, and they did. "She's the other daughter, isn't she?" one woman murmured. "Doesn't quite match the rest, does she?" Another replied, her voice like the snap of a fan. The table stretched beneath the chandeliers, long and gleaming, a throne disguised as dining. I slipped into my seat across from Claire, whose smile curved sharp as glass. Richard didn't look at me. Margaret barely nodded, already preoccupied with greeting acquaintances. The conversation rose around me like waves designed to drown out my presence. The first insult came quietly, almost playfully. An old associate of Richard's leaned forward, peering at me. "And what do you do these days, Evelyn? Something independent?" His pause was deliberate, his eyes flicking to my dress. Before I could answer, Claire cut in. "She's always been very independent," she said sweetly, the word dipped in poison. "Our family dinners aren't exactly her usual scene." Laughter rippled at the table. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip. The bitterness clawing at my throat was real, but so was the steel in my chest. They wanted me small. They wanted me to flinch. I wouldn't. More whispers trailed around the table, subtle reminders that I was the one who had walked away, the one who had been dismissed. Plates of foie gras and filet mignon arrived, but the food was only backdrop. The real feast was in the unspoken hierarchy, the constant measuring of worth. Claire's eyes glittered as she lifted her champagne. She leaned forward, just enough to command the attention of the guests. "To Evelyn," she declared, her voice pitched perfectly to Carrie, "finally affording dinner with us." The words landed like glass, shattering across marble. Polite laughter burst out, a chorus rehearsed over years of Carter cruelty. My fingers tightened around my glass, the cool stem grounding me. I felt the sting, but beneath it, something stronger stirred anticipation. From the corner of my eye, movement caught my attention. A waiter approached, his tray steady, his eyes scanning the table until they landed on me. Daniel Brooks. I hadn't seen him in years, not since we were both students working the floor of this very restaurant. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should have, recognition sparking quietly, deliberately. And in that glance, I understood. I wasn't alone. "Maybe just order an appetizer, Evelyn. We wouldn't want you bankrupting yourself." The words slid across the glossy mahogany table like a blade, wrapped in velvet. Candles flickered between tall crystal stems, throwing shadows that exaggerated every smirk, every arched brow. My fork hovered over the menu, the laughter of neighboring tables blurring into a low hum. I had heard worse before, but here, beneath chandeliers and the weight of expectation, it stung sharper. A memory pulled at me nights in college when the refrigerator was empty, when I skipped meals because my family had cut me off. I had survived on black coffee and determination, whispering promises to myself in cramped libraries. Hunger had become an old friend then, one my family never noticed, never cared to. And now, years later, they wielded that cruelty as casual banter. Richard raised his glass of Bordeaux, swirling it lazily before setting it down with a heavy clink. "Some of these wines," he said, voice booming, "could buy a month's rent in one of Evelyn's modest apartments." His eyes met mine, deliberate, daring me to flinch. Around him, guests chuckled politely, the kind of laughter people offered the powerful, whether they found humor or not. Claire leaned back, her emerald dress shimmering under candlelight, her lips curling into a smile that was all venom. "Oh, don't be mean, Daddy," she said sweetly. "Evelyn loves her little place. Cozy, isn't it? 1 bedroom? 2? Can't quite remember. But I suppose it must feel enormous after all that time. Slumming it." Her laughter was like glass breaking sharp, calculated to cut. Margaret, as always, sat composed, her pearls catching the light, her face perfectly neutral. She didn't defend me, but she didn't stop them either. Silence was her shield, and by wearing it, she became complicit. I laid my menu down with care, the corners aligning perfectly with the edge of my plate. "I'll manage," I murmured, my voice cool, detached. A cold smile traced my lips. It wasn't the smile of surrender, it was something harder, something honed. Beneath the tablecloth, my hands remained steady. They wouldn't see me break. Conversation swirled on stock markets, vacations in St. Tropez, the latest charity gala. Yet every so often, Richard's gaze returned to me, testing, pressing. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows grazing the tablecloth, his shadow stretching across the candlelight. His voice dropped, firm, commanding silence from the chatter around him. "Admit it, Evelyn," he said. Each word dripped like molten lead. "You've failed." The moment lingered, heavy as thunder before a storm. Forks paused midair. Even Claire's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, savoring the cruelty of the moment. My chest tightened, but my face was marble. I let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer, my smile carved deeper, colder. Then, movement broke the tension. A waiter approached, his steps measured, his tray balanced with effortless precision. "Daniel Brooks," His eyes found mine immediately, steady, knowing. He stopped at my side, bowing his head with just enough deference to be seen, but not so much as to appear servile. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said, voice low, but carrying. A deliberate pause, then the words that sliced through the Carter charade like a scalpel through silk. "Welcome back." Silence fell. Claire hissed, "Welcome back? What the hell does he mean?" Every eye turned, the chandelier's glow suddenly too harsh, illuminating faces frozen between curiosity and discomfort. My sister's words sliced through the hush, but I didn't flinch. I let the silence breathe, let it stretch until the tension became almost unbearable. Daniel stood poised at my side, the corners of his mouth hinting at something more than a polite server's smile. With one deliberate motion, he set the bottle of Bordeaux down, tilting it toward me with an almost ceremonial grace. "Your usual, Miss Carter?" he said smoothly, pouring into my glass with the kind of deference reserved not for a guest, but for someone who belonged. The effect was immediate. Richard sputtered, choking slightly on his own sip of wine, his napkin crumpling in his fist. Margaret's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against porcelain, in a sharp, brittle note. Claire's brow furrowed, confusion flickering into irritation as her perfectly painted lips parted. I did nothing but lift the glass Daniel had filled, swirling the liquid slowly until the garnet surface caught the light. Calm, unhurried, I tasted it with measured restraint. The air around the table thickened. I could feel whispers beginning to stir at nearby tables, murmurs threading through the glittering crowd. They weren't just watching the Carters anymore, they were watching me. Richard cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Your usual?" His disbelief rang louder than he intended, a crack in the armor of control he so meticulously displayed. Daniel inclined his head, professional but with a spark of mischief that only I caught. "Indeed, sir. Miss Carter has exquisite taste. She always prefers the 2009 vintage." Gasps and murmurs spread like ripples across water. Margaret pressed her lips together, white-knuckled around her napkin. Claire, however, leaned forward, her tone sharp as glass. "She's never even been here before." The lie hung in the air, desperate, flimsy. I met Claire's eyes across the table, and for the first time that evening, I allowed my smile to widen, cool, deliberate, a mirror, reflecting all her venom back at her. I raised my glass slowly, the stem steady between my fingers, the red swirl catching every gaze in the room. "Hasn't she? Do you remember why I cut you off the will, Evelyn? Because you were a waste." Richard's words slashed across the polished table like a blade, casual in their cruelty, delivered with that smug composure he wore so effortlessly in public. The flicker of candlelight carved deep shadows into the ridges of his face, making him look harsher, older, and yet more certain of himself than ever. Conversations at nearby tables softened, the weight of his words pulling attention toward us like gravity. I didn't move. My glass stayed perfectly still in my hand, though the stem dug into my fingers. Across from me, Claire grinned, lips curling in triumph as though the humiliation of her sister were the finest dessert. Margaret lowered her gaze, arranging her silverware with unnecessary precision. She said nothing as always, her silence the strongest form of betrayal. Richard leaned back, the chair groaning under the arrogance of his posture. "The Carter name, the Carter legacy, it belongs to those who can carry it with pride, not with excuses. That's why everything I built, everything that matters, will pass to Claire." His voice rose slightly on her name, and Claire raised her chin in satisfaction, lifting her crystal flute. I stared at the amber liquid in my glass, the surface trembling almost imperceptibly. His words dragged me backward in time. The conference room had been sterile and cold, all steel and glass, the law firm's emblem embossed in gold on the walls. Richard had signed each document with sharp, decisive strokes, and I had stood helpless while the lawyer slid the final page across the table. My name, once written clearly under beneficiaries, had been slashed through, erased as though I were nothing more than a mistake corrected with ink. "You're not cut out for this world," Richard had said then, his tone almost bored. "I won't waste resources on you." The memory bled into the present as Claire rose gracefully, glass in hand. "To the future," she declared, her voice ringing clear, drawing glances from the guests. "To carrying on the Carter Empire, and to honoring our father's faith in me." She clinked her flute against Richard's, Margaret's, and finally held it aloft as if expecting the entire restaurant to toast with her. Polite applause followed, a smattering of clinks and murmurs. I didn't lift my glass. I only watched, my gaze sharpening until every detail of her smugness burned into me like acid. Daniel, in the background, moved silently between tables, his tray balanced with effortless ease. Yet his eyes, those steady, watchful eyes, slid toward me when no one else was looking. He lingered a fraction too long, as if awaiting a cue. Richard noticed my silence and smirked. He leaned forward again, narrowing the gap across the table, his voice pitched low, but sharp enough for others to hear. "Look at you now. Still nothing. After all these years, you've proven me right." The words were meant to be final, crushing. Claire's laugh rang softly. Margaret dabbed her lips with her napkin, and the room resumed its muted hum. But my silence was not surrender. I felt the calm steel in my spine, the quiet burn of patience. I let him believe I had swallowed it all, just as he always had. Across the flickering table, Daniel paused mid-step, his gaze locking with mine. His eyes asked a question without words, waiting ready. I lifted my chin slightly, the barest nod, my signal unspoken. "Jonathan?" My breath caught as my past sat laughing at the next table. For a moment the restaurant blurred. The chandeliers, the chatter of New York's elite, even the sting of Richard's barbed words seemed to dissolve. All I saw was him. Jonathan Miller, once the man who had promised me forever, now leaning back in his chair, polished shoes crossed, an expensive watch glinting at his wrist. His laughter was louder than it needed to be, the sound of someone desperate to prove he belonged. Beside him, a sleek brunette rested manicured fingers on his arm, her jewelry sparkling as if in competition with the chandeliers. My chest tightened, memory uncoiling without mercy. That night years ago, the city rain had poured against the window of the cramped apartment I called home. Jonathan had stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his words cold and final. "You'll never be enough without money, Evelyn." The suitcase in his hand had been packed long before he spoke. I had begged him not with words, but with my silence, my stillness, my hope that he might look back. He hadn't. Now here he was wealthy, smug, and just close enough for fate to twist the knife. Claire noticed before anyone else. Of course she did. She leaned across the table, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Jonathan," she called, her voice carrying just far enough to draw heads. He turned, recognition sparking in his eyes, before he masked it with that same practiced smirk I used to mistake for charm. "Claire," he greeted, rising slightly. His gaze flickered past her and landed on me. For the briefest instant, his facade cracked. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a quick inhale. He hadn't expected me here, not like this. Claire wasted no time. "Do you remember Evelyn?" Her voice dripped with mockery. "Back when she couldn't even afford rent? I bet you've got some funny stories." Laughter rippled faintly around our table, though unease threaded through it. Jonathan chuckled, but it rang hollow. "Of course. How could I forget?" His eyes refused to linger on me for long. The room seemed to press in, his date blinking in confusion, unsure of why this reunion carried such sharp edges. Daniel appeared then, silent as ever, sliding into the scene with perfect timing. He poured into my glass with deliberate care, bowing slightly. His voice was pitched, just enough to carry across both tables. "For Miss Carter," he said, "only the finest, as always." Jonathan's smile faltered. The hand around his glass tightened, knuckles pale. His eyes darted between Daniel and me, piecing together something he hadn't wanted to see. "So," he stammered, attempting casualness but failing, "you come here often?" The question was absurd, flimsy, revealing more than it concealed. He was rattled. Claire leaned back, satisfied, watching for any sign of weakness in me. Richard smirked. Margaret kept her silence. But Jonathan was unraveling. Daniel set down a bottle unlike any other, its label rare, its presence unmistakable. He angled it toward me with reverence, as if this moment had been scripted long before. His words fell like a hammer onto the fragile glass of Jonathan's composure. "The owner's special selection, as always." The whispers spread like wildfire, burning holes into my family's facade. It began at the farthest corner of the dining hall, where a banker's wife leaned in too close to her husband, eyes darting toward our table. A ripple followed, subtle at first, then growing louder, sharper, until the murmur carried beneath the chandeliers like a second current under the music. People weren't just looking anymore, they were dissecting. Each glance, each tilt of the head, each muffled laugh carried weight. My family's name, so carefully polished by Richard over decades, was beginning to crack under the light. I felt it, the same way I once felt the Paris air when I walked alone through Montmartre after signing my second restaurant deal. No applause, no celebration, just me, a quiet pen, and the knowledge that I had stepped one rung higher on the ladder he swore I would never climb. I had stood under the iron lattice of the Eiffel Tower, promising myself that one day he would know. Tonight that promise whispered back through the velvet air of Le Magnifique. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her designer gown glittering under the chandeliers. "Don't look at her," she hissed toward no one in particular, her voice pitched too high, betraying her nerves. She forced a smile, clinking her glass, laughing louder than the joke demanded. "Everyone, please ignore this nonsense. The celebration is about me, not—" Her eyes sliced toward me. "This." But the crowd wasn't listening. Their eyes had shifted, the stage realigned. For the first time in years, Claire was not the focal point. I was. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached across the table, her pearls catching the candlelight. "Evelyn," she whispered, barely audible, her voice imploring, "please, don't cause a scene. For your father's sake, for the family's sake." Her desperation might once have moved me. Once, when I still believed she cared. Now, it was little more than confirmation her loyalty bound not to me, but to appearances. Always appearances. I placed my glass down with deliberate care. The faint clink echoed louder than it should have, silencing the table. I lifted my eyes, meeting hers with a calmness that was sharper than any raised voice. "A scene?" I said softly, letting the words cut the silence like silk tearing. "Mother, the night has only just begun." The murmurs ceased for a heartbeat, the air tightening like the moment before a storm breaks. And then sudden, blinding a spotlight shifted across the dining hall. The light, meant for the evening's entertainment, now landed squarely on me. The room gasped as if guided by a single breath, the focus no longer accidental but absolute. Daniel placed the velvet box on the table, and silence fell heavier than stone. The weight of that single gesture eclipsed the orchestra's soft strings, the clinking of silverware, even the breath of the crowd. All eyes followed the small, unassuming box as if it contained not an object but a verdict. My pulse steadied, slow and deliberate. I had waited too many years for this moment to tremble now. The golden chandelier above reflected in the polished wood of the table, casting fractured halos across Richard's wineglass. His hand twitched, the same hand that once signed the document erasing me from his will. Claire leaned forward, suspicion already sharpening her tone. "Really, Evelyn? What is this, another charity stunt? A magic trick to amuse the guests?" Her laughter was thin, brittle, the sound of glass under pressure. Daniel's white-gloved hands moved with ritual precision as he opened the box. Gasps escaped across the hall. Nestled inside was a key unlike any other, forged in gold, engraved with the crest of Le Magnifique. Its surface caught the chandelier light and threw it back like fire. To most, it was merely ornate. To those who knew, it was sacred, the master key to the wine cellar, the very heart of the restaurant. The flash of memory struck me. Paris, 2 years ago. I stood in the office overlooking the Seine, pen poised above papers that would make me owner of this place. When the final signature dried, the previous proprietor had pressed this very key into my palm. "Guard it well," he had said. "It is more than gold. It is authority." I had walked out into the Paris night, rain streaking the cobblestones, clutching it like a talisman against every cruel word my family had hurled. Tonight, the talisman glowed under 100 watchful eyes. Richard's voice broke the silence, sharp with disbelief. "What is this nonsense?" He turned on Daniel, eyes narrowing. "Explain yourself, boy." "Why are you humiliating us?" Daniel did not flinch. His gaze remained fixed on me, then shifted calmly to the room. "This key," he said, his voice carrying across tables, "unlocks the cellar where every vintage rests. No wine leaves it, no bottle is served without her approval." Laughter bubbled from Claire, desperate, unhinged. "Approval? You expect us to believe Evelyn, of all people, knows anything about Bordeaux? She lived off ramen noodles." A ripple of unease stirred the crowd. Guests exchanged glances. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, his date staring at the golden key as if it radiated heat. Margaret's hand gripped her pearls, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. Daniel bowed slightly, his voice steady, final. "Only the owner holds this key, and she is here." The words landed like a thunderclap. 100 whispers surged, colliding, filling the hall. The Carters' carefully woven illusion tore thread by thread. Richard's jaw clenched, veins rising against his skin. Claire's lips parted, but no retort came. For the first time, they were speechless. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. My hand closed gently around the stem of my glass, the ruby wine trembling only slightly with the motion. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise with the precision of a blade. "Now," I said, looking at each of them in turn, "shall we talk about failure?" The candles flickered on my father's cake, but the celebration was already dead. The waitstaff wheeled the confection forward, its tiers crowned with sparklers that hissed faintly under the chandelier light. Guests clapped out of habit, their applause hollow, distracted, their attention fixed on me rather than on Richard Carter, the man who had demanded this performance. The cake might as well have been a funeral pyre, each flicker of flame illuminating the cracks in his empire. I heard his voice echoing in memory, sharp as a blade. "Don't embarrass us tonight, Evelyn." How quaint those words seemed now, given the wreckage smoldering before him. He had feared my shame would stain his reputation. Instead, it was his arrogance unraveling, thread by thread, in front of everyone who mattered. Daniel approached the head of the table with steady composure, carrying a crystal decanter of vintage wine. He offered Richard a deferential nod, pouring a glass with grace. "A toast, sir," he said, his tone respectful, but edged with irony. Then, with a glance at me, he shifted. "But perhaps it is only proper that the final words tonight belong to Miss Carter." The dining hall stirred, voices rustling like silk curtains in a sudden breeze. Dozens of eyes swung toward me. Some glittered with curiosity, others with hunger, a few with envy. The Carters' guests were society's vultures, circling at the faintest scent of blood. And tonight, they had found their feast. Claire erupted before I could move, her shrill voice slicing the air. "This is absurd. She's a fraud. All of you know it. She's nothing. She's always been nothing." Her hand trembled as she gestured wildly at me, the diamonds on her wrist catching firelight. "Don't let her trick you. This is some pathetic stunt." Her desperation was almost pitiful. Almost. I stood slowly, the scrape of my chair deliberate, controlled. My palms rested lightly on the table before I straightened, my gaze sweeping across the room. My dress was plain black, unadorned, but in that moment it felt like armor, every seam stitched with years of silence and patience. The whispers swelled, pressing in from every direction. Jonathan fidgeted at his seat, his date wide-eyed, as if she had stumbled into a play she didn't understand. Margaret shook her head faintly, eyes pleading, still clinging to the hope that this disaster might be salvaged. Richard sat rigid, his face mottled with rage and disbelief, a man watching his carefully staged kingdom sink. I lifted my chin, my voice carried without strain, without rush. "You want the truth?" I let the question hang, the hush that followed deeper than any silence before. "Then hear it now." Every guest leaned forward, glasses tilted, forks stilled. Even the sparklers atop the cake seemed to fade into the background. "This," I said, letting my hands sweep across the hall, across the chandeliers, the velvet drapes, the polished marble floors, "is my restaurant. It has been mine for 6 months." For a breathless second, the words hovered in the air, suspended like the final note of a symphony. Then the room broke. Gasps cracked open like thunderclaps. A woman dropped her spoon. It rang against the floor. Jonathan's face drained of color. Richard jerked back, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering into glittering shards at his feet. Claire's scream tore through the chaos. "Impossible!" The sound rattled the chandeliers, a shriek of denial against the undeniable. "She's lying!" Claire's voice cracked, but no one believes her anymore. The shrill words ricocheted across the dining hall, too sharp, too desperate. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and murmurs rippled like wind through tall grass. Guests had come expecting champagne and laughter, but now they were witnessing a collapse. The Carter family name, once gilded and untouchable, trembled in the candlelight. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silence I held was louder than Claire's hysteria, and that terrified her more than any words could. Richard slammed a fist onto the table, rattling silverware. "Enough of this charade. Evelyn has always been a fraud, and she will die one. You think a clever smile and some staged waiter trick will undo years of proof that you are nothing?" His voice carried, fueled by years of contempt. It was the same tone he used when he stripped me of the will, declaring me useless, declaring me forgotten. Claire clutched at his sleeve, her face pale but defiant. She bribed him, father. Can't you see? That waiter, he's lying for her. It's an act, all of it. Look at her dress, her face. She can't afford this. She never could. Her words fell flat. The room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The performance no longer belonged to them. Margaret sat frozen, her fingers curled around the stem of her glass, knuckles white. She opened her mouth once, then closed it, unable to choose a side. Every ounce of her had been trained to preserve appearances, yet tonight appearances dissolved into smoke. And through it all, Jonathan lingered in the background. His jaw was tight, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He knew. He remembered every cruel word he'd spoken when he left me for wealth, and now he sat, watching the lie unravel, watching his own cowardice reflected back. I let them talk. I let the denial run its course. A last gasp of air before drowning. Daniel stepped forward, his presence steady as stone. He carried no silver tray this time, no bottle of wine. Instead, in his gloved hands, he held a thick leather folder. His voice was calm, the voice of someone who needed no embellishment. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, ladies and gentlemen. He laid the folder gently on the table, beside the untouched cake. There is no performance here. There is only fact. Richard sneered, but his hand trembled slightly. And what fact could justify this circus? Daniel opened the folder. The rustle of paper was almost sacred in the hush of the room. He drew out a document, crisp and stamped, and laid it flat on the white linen. The Carter crest embossed on the tablecloth gleamed faintly beneath the fluorescent seal of a notary. Claire leaned forward, her voice shrill. Forged! It must be forged! Number Daniel's reply cut like steel. He turned the page outward so every guest could see. Acquisition contract. Signed by Miss Evelyn Carter. Testified before 2 witnesses. Filed with the city clerk's office in October 2021. A collective gasp moved through the hall. Conversations rose in urgent whispers, words like legitimate, legal, signed, owner, floating in the air like sparks. I remained silent, hands folded neatly in my lap. There was no need to gloat. The truth did that for me. Jonathan finally looked at me, his eyes hollow. The weight of his past betrayal seemed to crush him in that instant, guilt pressing his shoulders down. He mouthed nothing, only stared, as if asking silently how he had ever underestimated me. Richard's hand shot forward, snatching the paper with more violence than control. His fingers trembled as he scanned the lines, his eyes darting desperately for an escape clause, a loophole, any chance to preserve his power. The veins in his neck strained, his lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then, hoarse and broken, he muttered, This can't be real." The words fell into the silence like a dirge, the first note of a requiem for the Carter legacy. Le Magnifique is only one piece of the puzzle, I said, savoring the silence. The words floated over the table like smoke curling from a candle wick. The room seemed to inhale at once, as though Manhattan's finest couldn't quite believe what they'd heard. Forks lay abandoned, crystal glasses hovered in midair, and the great Richard Carter, my father, stared at me as though I had grown a second head. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the moment breathe, letting their disbelief fester. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't falter. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter, the family's shameful secret. I felt like the architect of something none of them could ever imagine. A flash of memory struck me, vivid against the gilded walls. Paris, a drizzle-soaked evening, the Eiffel Tower a glittering promise in the distance. I had stood in front of polished doors carved with gold letters, Étoile Noire, my second flagship. I remembered holding the pen, signing the final document, with no one by my side, no one to cheer me on. Just me, my determination, and the knowledge that I was building a fortress out of the ashes they left me in. The memory faded, replaced by the glint of chandeliers above. Around me, the guests stirred, their curiosity too heavy to contain. "What does she mean?" a woman whispered, clutching her husband's sleeve. Someone else lifted a phone discreetly, red recording light winking as they leaned closer. The Carter family drama had become tonight's theater, and I finally was center stage. "London," I said, letting the syllables drop slowly, like pearls hitting marble. "Paris." Another pause, savoring the widening of eyes. "And Tokyo, opening next spring." A low murmur of awe rippled through the room. Men in tailored suits exchanged looks, calculating. Women whispered, some with admiration, others with envy. A table of young financiers leaned forward, already drafting the headlines in their minds. Carter daughter builds global empire. Richard's face darkened, the color of storm clouds before a hurricane. His fists tightened on the damning contract before him, veins bulging as if he could strangle the truth out of the paper. Beside him, Claire shook her head violently, her perfect curls quivering, lips forming the word no over and over again, as if denial could bend reality back into place. It was Margaret who broke the spell. Her voice came out thin, fractured, the voice of a woman who had never asked questions until the answers destroyed her world. "Why?" She blinked at me, mascara streaking faintly. "Why didn't you tell us? Your own family?" I turned to her slowly, my expression flat, my tone sharp as glass. "Because you never listened, Mother. Not once. You only ever heard what Richard wanted. You heard Claire's demands. But me?" I exhaled, shaking my head. "You muted me before I even spoke." The words carved through her like a blade. She wilted, shoulders collapsing inward, tears threatening to spill. And then crash. Claire's hand slipped, or maybe her rage betrayed her grip, and her crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor. Red liquid spread like blood across the polished stone. The sound was final, like a gavel. Her chest heaved as realization dawned not just about me, but about her. She was not the heir to an empire. She was nothing more than a girl clutching at shards, destined to inherit dust. I lifted my glass again, calm, deliberate, my eyes never leaving hers. The whispers grew louder, feeding on her unraveling. Across the table, Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. His hand tugged at his tie, his collar suddenly too tight. He laughed weakly to no one in particular, a hollow sound that only deepened the humiliation pressing on him. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. I should go." His face burned as every gaze turned to follow him. Without meeting my eyes, he excused himself, retreating toward the exit like a man chased by ghosts. And I let him. Let them all watch him flee, as if he were the last domino falling in a line I had set years ago. "You're still nothing without the Carter name," Claire spat, desperately breaking her voice. The words cracked as they left her throat, trembling between fury and fear. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for allies among the guests, but none came. The glittering audience had turned into silent jurors, their stares sharpening, their whispers sharpening even more. Under the chandeliers, her designer gown seemed less like armor, and more like a costume she could no longer fill. I leaned forward slowly, letting the silence stretch until her desperation hung in the air like smoke. "The Carter name," I repeated, my tone calm, mocking only by its restraint. "Is that really all you've ever had?" A murmur passed through the tables, polite society savoring the fall of a woman who had built her entire persona on borrowed prestige. My memory sharpened, recalling the countless ways she had twisted that name into a weapon against anyone who dared to resist her whims, and the irony that the name she clung to so desperately had always been tied to me. "Shall we remind them?" I asked, rising slightly from my chair. The tension was thick enough to taste. "Every restaurant you dined in, every door you demanded be opened, every manager you berated." Claire's lips parted, but no sound came. Her face flushed crimson. Daniel stepped closer, a silent witness until now, his presence steady. "It's true," he said, voice even, controlled. "Staff reported her behavior every time. The demands, the tantrums. And always one phrase repeated, 'I'm a Carter. Do you know who I am?'" A ripple of laughter rose from the guests, restrained at first, then louder, spreading like a contagion. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was sharp, cruel, the kind that cuts deeper than words. Claire's hands trembled at her sides. Her perfect mask began to splinter under the weight of their ridicule. I tilted my head, eyes never leaving hers. "And yet every time you dropped that name, Claire, you weren't invoking father. You weren't invoking mother. You were invoking me. Every glass of champagne served, every dish comped, every reservation miraculously cleared, it was my empire that granted it." I let the words linger, deliberate as a blade pressing against skin. Then I lowered my voice so the silence would fall again, and delivered the strike. "Every time you dropped my name, Claire, you begged me for favors." The laughter broke into open gasps. Claire staggered back a step, shaking her head violently, as if denial could erase the truth already devouring her. Her painted lips quivered, eyes pooling with tears. mascara trembling on the edge of collapse. She tried to speak, but the words drowned in the noise snickers, whispers, flashes of phones recording her humiliation. The proud Carter daughter, the woman who had always strutted through rooms like a queen, was now reduced to a spectacle. Her chair scraped against the floor, screeching like a final scream as she pushed herself away from the table. The tears finally fell, streaking her flawless makeup into ruin. Claire covered her face with trembling hands and stumbled toward the exit, each step uneven, clumsy, stripped of all the grace she once demanded. No one rose to follow her. Not Richard, not Margaret, not a single guest who once flattered her. She walked out alone, sobs trailing behind her like shattered glass scattered across marble. "Enough!" Richard roared, clinging to the last threads of authority. The sound cracked through the dining hall, but instead of commanding silence, it fell hollow. The chandeliers still glittered, the music still hummed faintly in the background, yet the air had shifted beyond his control. His voice, once thunder in my childhood, was now just another man's desperate attempt to grasp power slipping through his fingers. He slammed his fist onto the table, silverware clattering. "You will show me respect, Evelyn. I am your father. I built everything you see before you. I sacrificed so you could have the Carter name." His eyes burned with the same fire that once scorched my dreams, the same eyes that had looked into mine years ago across a mahogany desk at the lawyer's office and declared me unworthy. That memory seared to the surface now, uninvited but sharp. The smell of polished wood, the shuffle of papers, the cold pen sliding across parchment as he struck my name from his will. My voice had cracked back then, begging for even the smallest recognition, but he hadn't blinked. "You're a waste," he had told me. "You'll never carry this family forward." And now, here he sat, trembling, demanding respect that he had never earned. I rose from my chair, the motion calm, deliberate, and the hush that followed was absolute. "Respect?" My tone sliced through the stagnant air. "You dare demand respect when you erased me from your life, the moment I refused to bow to your rules? When you disowned me? When you told the world I was nothing but a mistake in your empire?" Margaret's sob broke the silence. "Please," she whispered, clutching at Richard's sleeve. "This is your father and your daughter. Stop this madness. We are family. Family." The word felt poisoned on her lips. My gaze hardened. "Family?" I said, voice steady, unwavering. "A family does not cut its blood out of its legacy. A family does not strip its own child of her worth to appease pride and power. You chose Claire. You chose your empire. You chose to destroy me." Mother stood by, and not once did either of you look back. Richard's hand trembled on the table, his knuckles white. "I did what I had to do," he spat, but there was no strength in it. His chest heaved, his face blotched with the rage of a man realizing the world no longer bent to him. I stepped closer, each word like steel hammered into stone. "You did what suited you. And tonight, I remind you your sacrifices were never for me. They were always for yourself. You disowned me years ago. Tonight, I return the favor." The words landed with finality, a blade cutting through generations of control. Margaret's sobs deepened, but I did not falter. My voice had never been clearer. The guests leaned in, holding their breath, savoring the undoing of a patriarch before their very eyes. Richard's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth, perhaps to roar again, but nothing came. His breath caught. His hands, once so steady, shook as if the weight of decades pressed down at once. His face drained of color, pale as ivory under the glittering lights. Then, slowly, as though his body finally betrayed the truth his words could not fight, he collapsed back into his chair. Shoulders slumped, his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His eyes no longer blazed, they flickered, dim, broken. The great Richard Carter, the patriarch who once ruled his family like a tyrant king, sat before me defeated. And for the first time in my life, I no longer feared him. The birthday candles smoked like incense over a funeral pyre. The last notes of the birthday song had faded into uneasy silence, the scattered guests whispering as they gathered their coats. A few still lingered, eager to catch every fragment of the drama that had unfolded, but most hurried toward the exit, unwilling to be further entangled in the Carters' collapse. The dining hall, once dazzling with laughter and arrogance, now echoed with the weight of shame. I stood, glass in hand, the flames flickering faintly in the shadows of my father's pale face. He slumped in his chair, his chest still heaving from the collapse of authority. his eyes glazed with disbelief. Beside him, Margaret clutched his arm, her pearls rattling against the stem of her wineglass, tears streaking her cheeks, as if she were mourning the death of the Empire more than the man himself. From the hallway beyond, muffled sobs betrayed Claire's humiliation, her empire of pretense shattered in front of the world. I lifted my glass, my voice sharp, carrying across the fractured remnants of the celebration. "Happy birthday, Father. Consider the truth my gift." The words cut the air like the clean stroke of a blade, and every guest, still present, turned, spellbound. No applause followed. No polite cheers, only the silence of recognition that a dynasty had ended, and a new one had risen in its place. Margaret rose, trembling, her hands outstretched. "Evelyn, please," she pleaded, desperation cracking through her polished exterior. "Don't let it end like this. We can find peace again. We can still be a family." Her voice wavered with the desperation of a woman who knew she had stood silent too long, complicit in her husband's cruelty, her daughter's arrogance, and her own cowardice. I lowered my glass, my expression unyielding. "Peace?" I said quietly, yet the entire room heard me. "Peace was never offered to me when you erased me from the will. When you watched as I was starved of love, dignity, and respect. No, Mother. Tonight ends exactly as it should." My tone carried no malice, no rage, only finality. Daniel stepped closer, his presence calm and steady, as if anchoring me in the storm I had created. His eyes met mine with silent approval. Together we turned toward the exit, leaving the broken fragments of a family empire behind. The last thing I saw was Richard, still gripping the unsigned pieces of authority that no longer meant anything, his lips trembling around words that would never come. Outside, the crisp autumn air struck my lungs like a baptism, sharp and pure. The city's neon glow stretched over us, indifferent to the collapse of a family name once considered untouchable. As we walked away, my phone buzzed against my palm. I glanced at the screen. A stream of messages from numbers I knew too well. Claire begging forgiveness, Margaret pleading for a meeting, Richard demanding explanations, bargaining like a man too late to reclaim his throne. I paused on the sidewalk, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I typed the only reply they would ever receive. "Reservations required. 3 months waiting list. No exceptions." I hit send, my smile sharp as the glass towers around me. Daniel hailed a car, but I shook my head. "Walk with me," I said. Tonight, I didn't need to be driven. I needed to feel the city's heartbeat under my feet. By morning, the papers would spread the story. The whispers of the night would harden into legend. But my focus had already moved on. At dawn, sunlight streaked across the windows of my office overlooking Manhattan. Tokyo's blueprints lay across my desk, contracts ready for signature. My empire was still growing, stretching far beyond the Carter name. I placed my hands on the papers, the edges crisp, the ink bold. And with the same steadiness that had carried me from the shadows to this very moment, I whispered to myself, "Justice comes late, but it always arrives." The empire that once silenced her voice now lay in ruins, and Evelyn walked away not as the forgotten daughter, but as the author of her own justice. Her journey proved that betrayal may wound deeply, but it cannot bury truth forever. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict echoes louder than years of silence. Like a candle relit in the dark, justice may come late, but when it burns for all to see. Allied, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt the same fire of justice, or 2 if you think the story could go further.